influences of such economists as Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, and Milton Friedman. This 50-minute event was part of the Foundation for Economic Education's National Convention last month in Las Vegas.
I'm Joanne Skousen. I'm the Director of Education at the Foundation for Economic Education. My husband, Mark Skousen, is our next speaker. Mark started his career with the CIA as an economist and an economic analyst, and he has also been teaching economics and finance at Rollins College for the last 15 years, until September when he became the president of the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington, New York. He's written several books on economics, including Economics on Trial, Puzzles and Paradoxes in Economics, excuse me, a new textbook called Economic Logic, and his latest book, The Making of Modern Economics, published by M.E. Sharp, and the focus of this talk today. The Making of Modern Economics is a controversial new history of the lives of the great economic thinkers, beginning with Adam Smith. It's already in its second printing, and it has been translated into a dozen languages. Mark Blaug, the foremost authority in the history of economics, calls it extreme but unputdownable. Foreign Affairs magazine called it both fascinating and infuriating. David Collender of Princeton University calls it irreverent, passionate, entertaining, and mischievous. Richard Swedberg of the University of Stockholm says it is one of the most original books ever published in economics. James Otteson, professor of philosophy at University of Alabama, comments that Skousen's history indeed reads like a novel or a detective story, and I was delighted to see Adam Smith as the hero of his story. Skousen is opinionated, but he is honest enough to give objective summaries of his opponents and shortcomings of the economists he likes. I can only say, bravo. And Stephen Cates of the Australian Chamber of Commerce reports, I couldn't put it down. The musical accompaniments for each chapter are a wonderful touch. Humor permeates the book and makes it accessible like no other in history. It sets the standard. So with that, let's find out what they're all talking about with Mark Skousen and the Making of Modern Economics.
Thank you very much, Joanne. It's a delight to talk about the making of modern economics. I think the first thing that I'd like to do is to talk to you why I wrote this book, because if you go and look in the library, if you've ever taken a course in the history of economics, you'll see that dozens of books have been written on this subject. However, I would say that the vast majority of these books have two problems with them. One is the content. They tend to be very incomplete. They leave out a lot of great economists, and I think it's due to their bias. A lot of bias exists in these histories of thought. I'm not sure why, but it does seem to be a problem. The book that is the most popular book that's ever been written on the history of economics is called The Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbroner. And Heilbroner has written a delightful history. It's fun to read, but he leaves out major characters, and these are characters that he apparently is not particularly sympathetic to, so he simply leaves them out. And the classic example of this is in the new edition of The Worldly Philosophers. Not a single word is said about Milton Friedman of the Chicago School of Economics. Now imagine Milton Friedman was very close to being voted by Time magazine as the economist of the century. They gave it to Keynes, and I think rightly so, but the editor-in-chief of Time magazine felt Milton Friedman deserved the economist of the century. And so here's Heilbroner writing this book, and Friedman's name's not even mentioned. So if you were a student reading about economics, you wouldn't even know who Milton Friedman is. And I think that's a travesty. So one of the reasons I wrote my book was I wanted to include people who should not be ignored, whether I agree with them or not. So certainly I don't think much of Marx as an economist, but I have a big chapter about Marx, and it would be absurd for me to ignore him. The other thing that I found was that the theme, there was no central theme in the history of economics. It was a hodgepodge of, well, here's what one economist thinks, and here's what another economist thinks. And there's no storyline, no line of thinking as to, well, here's the right way, here's the right path, so to speak, and here's how these economists fell away from the right path, and here's how they got back on the right path. There's none of that kind of storyline in the story of economics. So there is no story in the worldly philosophers or any of the other histories of thought. It just kind of drifts along. And I felt that this was unfortunate. Not that it could be remedied. I had to ask myself, was there a story of economics? So I have one slide. I want to show my first slide here. This is the traditional approach that's used, as in political science. There's what I call the pendulum approach to telling the story of economics. And that's where you see economists portrayed from left to right. And so you have Marx as the radical on the extreme left, and then you have Adam Smith on the extreme right as the conservative, and then Keynes as, these are the big three in economics, Adam Smith, Keynes, and Marx. And so you have Keynes in the middle as the liberal middle of the roader. And this is the standard approach that's used. The problem I have with this is that with the pendulum approach, the extreme left and the extreme right are two extremes, and they both appear bad. And so therefore, perhaps the best is where the pendulum rests, which is, of course, in the middle where Keynes is. And so most economists would say, yeah, that's appropriate. And I had some real problems with that, especially the equating of Adam Smith's view of the world with Karl Marx's view of the world. So I decided that I didn't think that this was an appropriate approach, and so I took a very different approach. And if you look at the next, this is the approach that I took, which I called the totem pole approach to economics. And so I've reversed things, I've changed things quite a bit here. I have Adam Smith and his invisible hand vision of economics, that really the founder of modern economics, as the head. In the traditional Indian folklore, the greatest chief is on the top, and then it goes down. Not denying that all of these economists aren't great. They are great economists, and they made great contributions to economics. Nevertheless, Adam Smith, in my opinion, should be at the top. And why is that? Because countries that have adopted the Adam Smith vision of free market capitalism, or democratic capitalism, if you will, have basically been vindicated by history. They have the highest standard of living, they have more leisure time, they have more material goods and services, and I actually think the quality of life is better among the countries that have adopted a small government, not a totalitarian government. On the other hand, those that have adopted a Marxist view, and yes, he was primarily a critic of capitalism, but he also was a strong believer in socialism and central planning. And countries that have adopted heavy doses of socialism and central planning have simply failed time and time again. So I don't think it's fair at all to equate Marx with Smith, and so I've put Karl Marx as the low man on the totem pole, so to speak. And then we have Keynes in the middle as an interventionist on the macro level, who also seemed to adopt laissez-faire on the micro level, so I felt he deserved to be in the middle ground, but under Adam Smith. So this is the approach that I have taken. Now, one of the things that I tried to do in my book, the other problem with the history of economics is that it really didn't do a lot for students. There were never any photographs of the economists. So you really didn't know what they looked like. You didn't know whether they had 4 arms or two or 4 legs or what have you, if they were really real people. Most of the books talked about their theories and didn't really get into their lives. So I tell a lot of things that are rather unusual about the economists. A lot of people don't know that Adam Smith burned his clothes one time when he was the customs official. And at the end of his life, he burned his papers. So I call him the first pyromaniac economist. So we had a lot of fun with the economists. I have lots of illustrations and photographs. And the other thing that I did was I selected classical music numbers, and I'm going to play 5 of them here during my presentation, of music that I've selected to represent each of the economists. So the first one, if Tim, you can turn on the music for the first one. This is the music representing Adam Smith and his great book, The Wealth of Nations, which came out in 1776. Which for we as Americans, a very prominent year that we all remember as the Declaration of Political Independence, but it was also a declaration of economic independence with the great book, The Wealth of Nations, which really established modern economics. So this is the music I've selected for him. It's simple, powerful, and beautiful. Representing the Smithian model of the invisible hand. Anybody recognize this? It's not the Olympics. Copeland, Fanfare for the Common Man. Okay, so go ahead. So that's the first selection, and no, yeah, just not the next one, not the next one, just the first one. Okay. So what I've discovered with putting Adam Smith at the top of the totem pole was that I had a storyline. Instead of before this hodgepodge of economists and what they were saying, I now had a hero, a heroic figure from which we could draw a plot. And the drama is over this basic ideological plot, if you will, that Adam Smith represented as a heroic figure. And that ideological plot is the invisible hand doctrine. I want to explain just a little bit of what I mean by the invisible hand doctrine, because it's key to understanding all the other economists, Marx and Keynes and everyone else that's discussed in my book, The Making of Modern Economics. So what is this invisible hand doctrine? It's only mentioned one time, one sentence in a 800-page book, The Wealth of Nations. And basically what Adam Smith said was the private acts of self-interested individuals would lead as if by an invisible hand to the public good. Private, selfish acts of individuals leading to the public weal, the benefiting the common man. And so what did we mean by that? What did he mean by that? And he actually meant it as a religious symbol, because God is invisible. How many have seen God? Very few on earth have seen God. You see, he's invisible. And yet we believe, many of us believe in God. And some people have a lot of faith that God exists. Others have a little faith. And some have no faith that God exists. And he thought this was a wonderful symbol of the capitalist system. The quiet, private acts of individuals, they're engaging in commerce every day. They're not on C-SPAN, they're not on NBC or CBS or ABC, but we're all out there doing a variety of things. And it's leading to this common good. Or is it, you see? It's like an invisible hand. And so we have, all of us in this room have varying degrees of faith on whether capitalism leads to the public good or not. Some believe that, some have a lot of faith in freedom. Libertarians generally have the most faith that the individual acts of private citizens will lead to the common good. Many others have no faith in it, and they believe in a central controlling power. And so you have a variety of opinion, and it's very controversial. Milton Friedman, the great libertarian economist, once said that Adam Smith was as radical in his promoting of laissez-faire as we libertarian economists are today. And I think he had an important point there. So freedom is still very radical when we look at the questions of legalizing drugs, whether we should allow immigrants to come into our country, whether we should lower the drinking age from 21 to 18. It's very controversial as to whether we should allow that sort of thing or not. And Adam Smith believed in the broadest amount of maximum faith in freedom, or what he called natural liberty, his system of natural liberty. And essentially it was, let's maximize the amount of freedom that people have economically, politically, religiously. Let's introduce competition, and competition is a critical element in Adam Smith's model. He hated monopolists, and he had rather disparaging things to say about business people who tried to monopolize government or industry. Now, Leonard Read, the founder of the foundation that I'm now president of, the Foundation for Economic Education, had a wonderful example of the invisible hand, and he used the example of the pencil. Milton Friedman used the example also in his book, Free to Choose. And he said the pencil is a great example of the invisible hand doctrine, because you have thousands, if not millions, of individuals involved in the production of a simple little pencil, and the raw products of this pencil come from all over the world. The rubber from Brazil, perhaps, the little metal here, the iron ore from Michigan, the wood itself perhaps from the Northwest, and the paint perhaps from Europe, all over the world. And every one of them are engaging in a profit motive. Most of them don't even know they're making a pencil. And yet the end result is something that we all benefit from, and it's called the pencil, and we use it today, although we've tended to use more pens and so forth, and the pencil is becoming more and more obsolete. But anyway, Leonard Read talks about this, and he says, and it's funny because no single individual can make something as simple as a pencil. It's a delightful essay, and I highly recommend it. We've reprinted it on our website, fee.org. Just go there and you can read it, or you can get one of our pamphlets, iPencil, that Leonard Read has put out. Okay, but then once the Adam Smith model was developed, I have this whole chapter called It All Started with Adam. That was going to be the original title of my book, but the publisher said, no, it'll end up in the religious section, so you better stick with The Making of Modern Economics, which is, kind of a dry academic type title, but inside those 500 pages I've really tried to bring to life this great dramatic story. It's really the story of freedom taught through the eyes and ears, the lives of the great economic thinkers, and I start with Adam Smith. But then comes along the counterplot, those who fight freedom, and were opposed to the Smith model of giving people free rein economically, especially. And I talk about a number of individuals who, in fact, some of Adam Smith's disciples, Ricardo and Malthus, in rather disparaging ways, really gave the epitaph, dismal science came from Malthus and Ricardo and their iron law of wages and subsistence level of existence because of overpopulation and not enough resources and what have you. Adam Smith was very optimistic, but some of his disciples were rather pessimistic. But the ultimate pessimist to capitalism is described, and we're going to play some music now to represent this counter Smithian. This will be music number 2 here. And it builds, and you kind of give a sense of who this economist is. But you see, Adam Smith basically described his model as a harmony of interests, and would be socially orderly, and there would be universal opulence, and there would be stability in the Smithian system. But this enemy, if you will, of Smith was quite the opposite. He viewed capitalism as alienating and exploitive. He saw, instead of harmony of interests, he saw class interests and class struggle. Instead of social order, he saw chaos and crisis. Instead of an invisible hand, he saw the iron fist of capitalism. And that's represented by this music. Kind of feels like Darth Vader has just entered the room, you see. Anybody recognize this music? Hosts, the planets, Mars, the bringer of war. Kind of dark and sinister. Okay. And indeed, Marx was a critic of capitalism. And he did have some insights. I talk in my chapter on Marx, which is called Marx Madness, plunges economics into a new dark age. So you kind of know where I stand on Marx. But Marx did make some positive contributions, and I talk about that at the end of my chapter. But overall, I think he had a negative impact in the world, politically, economically, as a result of Marxism, Leninism. And we've gone through a tremendous period of time of great destructive powers in the name of Marxism. Marxism has never really caught on in the economics profession as much as it has in sociology and anthropology and other areas where it's made more positive contributions. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story. At Rollins College, we have a Marxist professor in the economics department. His name is Eric Schutz. And I had a fun time with him one time. I went into his office and I presented him with a silver dollar. And I said, I'd like to present this silver dollar and give it to you as a gift and on one condition. If you can name the economist who died in the year this coin was minted. And if you look at the coin, it says 1883. And he looked at it and he says, oh, that's easy. I know who died. It was Karl Marx. And I said, that's right. Don't ever forget it. He's dead. But Professor Schutz had a real good response. He says, yes, but I'm alive. And that's very true. On college campuses, Marxism is very much alive. And Dinesh D'Souza, I see he's in the audience, will be our next speaker. And he'll tell you that Marxism is very much alive on college campuses. But not so much in economics. There's a radical element of economics. There are Marxists like Professor Schutz and others. But in large measure, it hasn't had the impact. And the reason is primarily because of the next group, who I don't have listed on here, but they would be one of the wings. I've got two wings for Adam Smith here. And one of the wings is the Austrian School of Economics. And if you want to start playing some of the Austrian music, and I'll explain why I selected this particular music. It's not as strong, so you have to listen a little bit more carefully. But it's a beautiful waltz, though it doesn't start out as a waltz, as my wife points out to me, but eventually gets there. Anyway, it kind of builds rather slowly, and then you'll notice a rather significant change in the music as this is presented. So let's just take a moment and listen to this wonderful waltz, and we'll see if you can recognize what this is. There's a change. The Emperor's Waltz. That's right. Now, what happens there when the music suddenly rises dramatically? It's by Strauss, Johann Strauss. The emperor enters the room. See, it's just pleasant music. It's just pleasant music, you know, you're just kind of listening, and suddenly it rises up very dramatically because the emperor has entered the room. And who is that emperor in economics that countered this tremendous negative force in economics? It is Karl Menger and the founding of the Austrian School of Economics, followed by his disciples Eugen Böhm-Bawerk, who was the finance minister in Austria for many years, and then became a professor. And then later on in the 20th century, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, may have heard of those names. Hayek won the Nobel Prize. They're all from the Austrian school. Well, what was it from the Austrian school that made this dramatic change and countered the Marxists? Well, one of the principles of Marxism was the labor theory of value, that all goods, the value of goods were based in the labor embodied in the production process, and it delegitimized the capitalist and the landlord who were gaining profits and interest. And according to the Marxists, they really didn't deserve this. The whole product was for the laborers, and the laborers therefore should own the means of production, and that was accomplished through nationalization and socialism and central planning, which is what the Soviet model was based upon. So what was it that the Austrians said that countered that? And basically what Menger did in his Principles of Economics, and I have a whole chapter on this, and it's called Out of the Blue Danube. It's worked on that title for some time. The Austrians, Karl Menger and the Austrians reversed the tide. And what was it that they accomplished? Well, they demonstrated, Menger in particular demonstrated that cost was not the ultimate determination of price, that it was dependent upon consumer demands. And it didn't matter how much something cost, if the consumer didn't want it, the price was not going to reflect the cost. It was going to reflect what consumers really wanted for. So it was called the theory of imputation. And it was a devastating critique of Marxism. And the other factors came from Böhm-Bawerk, Menger's student, who said there are two reasons why capitalists and landlords deserve interest in profits. And one is that the capitalist has to wait to be paid. The worker does not. The worker is paid every 2 weeks or every week like clockwork, no matter what the accounts receivables and accounts payables are, unless the company goes under. So there's no waiting that's required. The other factor is the risk factor. Capitalists take risks that workers do not. And both of those justify a higher profit margin and the payment of interest. And these were devastating arguments to the Marxists. And the marginalist revolution, which was part of this Austrian revival of Smithian economics, is basically was an extremely important critical period of history in the 1870s in the history of economics and the story of freedom. And what's amazing is that most histories of thought miss that. In fact, I was looking at a new history of economics that didn't even mention Menger by name. And yet Knut Wicksell, the great Swedish economist who was a contemporary of Menger and Walras and Jevons, who are considered the founders of the marginalist school. There's three economists who discovered the marginalist revolution. And it was Wicksell that said it was the Austrians who first propagated the concept of this marginalist revolution and the subjective value of consumer goods and so forth. So, but that's been lost in histories, and I put it back in. I put it back in as a critical role in the history of the great economic thinkers. And then economics became a science, if you will. Alfred Marshall, the great British economist, was the one who changed the name from political economy. He wanted to imitate the physical sciences. Many of you, physics. You need to have a name like physics or mathematics or logic. So economics became the word, you see. It sounded so much more scientific. And indeed, the principles of economics was the term that Alfred Marshall used. So as we entered the 20th century, there was one problem. There was one major problem in economics that had not been resolved. And in many ways, even to this day, economics has not solved this problem. So even though my storyline ends on a positive note and I talk about the triumph of market economics and Smithian economics, there's still one troubling area, and that's in the area of money, the understanding of money, the origin, the mystery of money, and the role of central banks, and the chaotic conditions that arise from time to time related to money. And this was an issue that that Irving Fisher grappled with. His own quantity theory of money failed him. He was the Milton Friedman of the early 20th century, Irving Fisher from Yale University. It failed him, the quantity theory of money, which he basically argued that if you didn't have a sharp increase in the price level, you couldn't have a depression. So Irving Fisher, who was an oracle of Wall Street, worth $10 million in 1929 because of one invention. Do you know what he invented? It's something every business person uses every day. Anybody know? It's the Rolodex. He invented the Rolodex. And Remington Rand bought his patent, and he had $10 million of Remington Rand stock, and so he wanted the bull market on Wall Street to continue forever. So I have this wonderful account. And by the way, Irving Fisher is one of the most fascinating economists, and he's given short shrift all the time in these history of thought books. I give him a whole chapter. He's absolutely fascinating. But he ended his life miserable. Yale University had to buy his home and rent it to him rent-free because he lost everything in the 1929 crash. And it really is an amazing story. And so the big issue is capitalism comes under its greatest threat. And I call it the Keynes Mutiny. It's my chapter. Keynes Mutiny, the introduction of John Maynard Keynes, who made a valiant attempt to save capitalism from its own destruction, from this problem of money. And so I have him there, and I have some music to represent Keynes and his policy approach to solving the problems that we encountered with the Great Depression. So listen to this music. Anybody recognize this one? Cacciatorian? Saber dance. That's right. Well, it doesn't change much throughout the entire music here. So you get a general image, but what are we talking about here? What was his policy prescription? Well, it was in large measure, get the economy going, spend, get the economy going as fast as you can, run deficits. We can cut it off at this point to get the general idea. And why did he believe that? Why did he make such a central point that government needed to be the key savior of a capitalist system? And basically it goes back to the invisible hand doctrine. Like Marx, but not as bad as Marx, Keynes, he lacked faith that the capitalist system could maintain its stability. And he questioned the invisible hand doctrine. I have a whole little section in my book called Keynes the Palm Reader. Now, I don't know how many of you knew this, but Keynes actually enjoyed reading people's hands. He analyzed people's hands. So when he met you, he wouldn't look into your face. He'd look at your hands. He would examine it. When he met FDR, he was so carried away with looking at his hands and describing them that he forgot to talk about deficit spending and the silver standard. And so the Depression continued, you see, for 3 or 4 more years. If you read his best book, and it's The Economic Consequences of the Peace. So I need to turn this around. The Economic Consequences of the Peace, there's a real interesting account in there. It's this wonderful history that where he describes the impact of the Versailles Peace Accords after World War I. And he stormed out of the Versailles Peace Accords. He was part of the British delegation there. And he stormed out, and the reason he stormed out was because he knew the consequences of this draconian policies. And of course, that included all these reparations and billions of dollars of German marks. And he knew it would result in hyperinflation, and he even predicts war in this book. Economic consequences of the peace was his first bestseller, and in my opinion, his greatest work. Beautifully written and very accurate in prediction. Well, in the beginning, he describes each one of the political figures who was there. And so he describes Woodrow Wilson from the United States as a rather weak man, a weak president. Why? Because his hands were weak. When he shook his hands, he was not impressed. And Lloyd George, on the hand, rough, gruff individual, overbearing. And indeed, that's the kind of hands he describes. And then he comes to Clemenceau, the president of France. He wore gloves. Very disappointed. And so I say in my book, and now you understand why Keynes had so much problems with the invisible hand doctrine of Adam Smith. You see, economists can have a little bit of humor, you see. All right. Well, my final individual who kind of saves the day for capitalism, the chapter of this is called Milton's Paradise, named after Milton Friedman. His counter-revolution, his monetary counter-revolution, extremely critical in the history of economics. And this is why Heilbronner made such a major blunder in ignoring Friedman. You cannot ignore Friedman's contribution. He won the Nobel Prize appropriately in 1976, 200 years after Adam Smith, because he embodies the Adam Smith vision of the invisible hand doctrine. He's the one who restored, almost single-handedly, faith in capitalism, that it can function on its own and it can rise up out of the dust and doesn't have to plunge us into some great economic cataclysm. And he actually, he wrote the book, A Monetary History of the United States, with Anna Schwartz, this magnificent empirical work where he actually invented M1 and M2. You know, we all have these descriptions of money supply that didn't exist in the 30s. And so the view was always held that the government did everything they can, the Federal Reserve did everything they can to keep the Great Depression from happening, but they failed miserably, and so you needed fiscal policy to intervene. Well, Friedman proved that old theory wrong, and he did it with one page out of 800 pages in A Monetary History. The book is worth buying for one page. Not just one page, but one paragraph. And not just one paragraph, one single sentence. And you know what the sentence is? The money supply declined by over 1/3 from 1929 to 1932. And the Federal Reserve was not impotent, but in fact, it was a demonstration of their incredible power, because the Federal Reserve engineered and allowed to take place, certainly, the Great Depression because of the collapse of the money supply, which was totally unnecessary. So it was a result of Milton Friedman. This argument has convinced over time more and more economists, and it was for that reason, in my opinion, that he won and deserved the Nobel Prize and has the tremendous influence that he has today. Nevertheless, despite all of this, despite the triumph of market economics and certainly the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet communism and China adopting capitalism, is all very much in the Friedman model, and also the 20th century. I would be remiss to leave out Mises and Hayek. Ludwig von Mises was the one who said socialism cannot work. And Heilbronner, who for many years a socialist, finally admitted in the New Yorker, Mises was right. It's right in print in 1989, 1990. So that's really an amazing admission. So Mises and Hayek, and if you saw the PBS series, The Commanding Heights, you saw the influence of Mises and Hayek in dealing with the central planning arguments of socialism. So my final chapter is called Dr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Triumph of Market Economics. And indeed, I think it has triumphed in many ways. But the problem is, you still have the money problem. The Federal Reserve, how much faith does Alan Greenspan, a devotee of Ayn Rand, and yet how much faith does Alan Greenspan have that the market will recover on its own? Well, I question how much faith he has in that kind of a system. I question how much of a devotee he is of Adam Smith's invisible hand doctrine. I kind of suspect that he believes a little bit more in the visible hand of stimulating the economy with increasing the money supply or tightening and playing the boom-bust cycle that we've all experienced over the last few years. So the business cycle is not over, the recessions are not over. We're going to see more of these as a result because we just haven't found a solution. Is it the gold standard? We seem to be very fearful of the gold standard, which has been the tradition of the Austrian school. And what is the money supply if you increase the money at a steady rate? So these are kinds of the issues that I end. But my heroic figure, Adam Smith, comes back to life after almost lying dead as a result of Keynes, as a result of Marx, and then in the Keynes and the Great Depression. But he somehow comes alive, and but I ultimately end up with the great quote from Milton Friedman and George Stigler, who say that freedom is a rare and delicate flower. We must treat it carefully. Thank you very much. Oh, and when we finish the question and answer, I'll put on the music that I have for Milton Friedman, so not quite yet.
First question. Mark, I understand you were not always an advocate of Adam Smith. How did your conversion come about?
Yeah, that's true, because what happened was when I first started writing this book, it was a very cynical book. I was actually under the influence of the libertarian economist Murray Rothbard, who has written some brilliant things. And I was really caught up in what Rothbard had to say more than Friedman in the early part of my career. And so Rothbard had, I actually commissioned him in 1980 to write a kind of a Contra Heilbronner history of thought. It's supposed to be 12 chapters long and 300 pages and written in 1 year. And 15 years later, he wrote half the book, and that was 2,000 pages long. It wasn't what I was intending. But in the book, he has this chapter called The Celebrated Adam Smith, and it's a very negative assessment of Adam Smith, basically saying that Adam Smith had this labor theory of value concept as part of his theory, and it led to Ricardo and the labor theory of value and Marxism. So he really, Rothbard really criticized Adam Smith, and I was caught up in that as I was writing the book. And I took my first chapter out to Utah, and I was meeting with my uncle Cleon, who many of you may have known, Cleon Skousen, a longtime conservative, and I was talking to him, and he said, you know, it's a funny thing. I was telling him about my book, and he said, it's a funny thing. The Adam Smith doctrine, the invisible hand doctrine, is inspired of God. And it just took me aback. I thought, you know, maybe I'm making a mistake going down this road of Rothbard's view, a negative view of Adam Smith. And so I was writing this book. In fact, my original title was called The Propensity to Confuse, a little play on Keynes's propensity to consume. But it was a very negative and dark book. And I said, well, who's right? Is Rothbard right, or is my Uncle Cleon right? And so I decided, you know, there's only one way to find out. So I picked up a copy of The Wealth of Nations, and I read it cover to cover to make up my own mind. And it took me quite a little time to do that, but when I was all through, I put the book down and I said, my uncle is right and Murray Rothbard is wrong. And it completely changed my outlook, and it's amazing. The book just exploded in terms of interest, and I was able to create this plot and everything that I'm telling you about. So I know I made the right decision.
To a certain extent, you've answered this next question. There are actually a couple that I'll put together. One was, could you name your top 5 economists of all time and also the worst 5 economists? You've kind of addressed that already, but you might want to go back to it. And then, out of the field of contemporary economists, who do you think will be the next great economist who is up and coming in the field?
Well, you could give a whole speech on what my 5 favorite are and my 5 worst, but I'd like to just focus on a couple of economists that are often ignored. Jean-Baptiste Say is one of the greatest economists, and Say's law is profound. And it's been totally misunderstood as a result of Keynes. And Stephen Cates from the Australian Chamber of Commerce has written a wonderful book called Say's Law and the Keynesian Revolution. And he demonstrates very clearly our understanding of Say. Certainly Say and Bastiat as well, the French tradition. And I'd even add Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville in that category. The great French laissez-faire school deserves a lot more credit. I also have right in the middle of my book kind of a time where you just sit back and admire the beauty of the neoclassical structure of economics that had been built up until time of Alfred Marshall. And normally at that time period, all the other books bring in the criticisms of Thorstein Veblen on the capitalist system. And that's all the person they have. And I discovered there's an economist who considered himself an economist, even though he's considered one of the founders of sociology. And that's Max Weber. Max Weber deserves much more interest among economists. And I have a whole chapter about his Protestant ethic and his discussion of religion. So I certainly would put him in that category. Fisher, of course, in the 20th century. My chapter on Mises is called The Missing Mises because he's missing all the time in these other books. He certainly deserves a lot more interest, and certainly Rothbard does too. In today's world, there's lots of areas of economics that are interesting. Experimental economics, I find absolutely fascinating. The work by Vernon Smith, and who's now at George Mason University. And I also like what Roger Garrison is doing at Auburn. His book, Time and Money, is an excellent book. But we need to do more empirical work to support the Austrian school, like the Chicago school has done. The Chicago school has just had tremendous success with its empirical studies to support its theoretical underpinnings. And the Austrians have shied away from empirical studies over the years, and I think that's been a mistake.
We have a couple of questions about what other economists have said about about Adam Smith. First, Emma Rothschild's Economic Sentiments, in which she discusses Adam Smith. What do you think of that? And also, Marx cites Smith repeatedly in his work as part of the foundation of his theory. Did Marx view Smith as an enemy?
Well, I've certainly, it's true that Marx read Smith when he was at the London Library, but he focused primarily on Ricardo. It was Ricardo that took economics down the dangerous road. I call it Tricky Ricardo is my chapter on Ricardo. And he is very tricky because he has very positive contributions and then very negative things. And Ricardo drew out the labor theory of some of the labor theory from Smith, but it was primarily his own focus that Marx drew upon. And I think overall Marx was pretty negative about Adam Smith. As far as Emma Rothschild's, I haven't read her book yet. I've got a copy of it. She sent it to me, as a matter of fact, and I haven't read it. And so I'll reserve judgment on hers. But she talks about several other French economists, which I found really interesting. So it's nice to see some of these other great economists being brought to the forefront.
Okay, we have some theoretical questions, but we also have some questions about fees, so I'm going to do those first because they're faster. One person said, I'm curious to know how many people here have been to a fee seminar in the past 50 years. So if maybe we could just do a show of hands of those of you who... My goodness, this is a great number. I would say at least a third have been to fee seminars. Related to that, a person asks, would Milton Friedman consider coming to Fee Fest 2003? And does Friedman stay in touch with Fee? Very much. And do you want to talk about Friedman's relationship with Fee?
Yeah, the Foundation for Economic Education was founded by Leonard Read, as I mentioned, the author of I, Pencil, started in 1946. And it's been an interesting cycle, if you will, the relationship between the Chicago School. See, if you have the two wings up there with Adam Smith, you have the Austrian School on one side and the Chicago School on the other. And I see them more cooperative than, they're more friends than foes. And as Milton Friedman said, well, really, they're friends and foes. And there are just areas where they agree and areas they disagree. And Fee has been kind of in the middle of that. And for a while, I remember 1946, one of the very first essays that Fee published was Roofs or Ceilings by Milton Friedman and George Stigler, arguing for deregulation of the rent controls in New York City. And it was considered quite controversial. It was reviewed very negatively in the American Economic Review. It's just amazing, saying that, oh yeah, we should keep these rent controls in New York. Then they had a falling out, and Mises and Hayek, especially Mises, he taught regularly at Fee. And there was a real strong Austrian bent. In fact, Larry Wimmer, my mentor at Brigham Young University, he went to the University of Chicago and was a devotee of Friedman. So he went to a Fee seminar one time. And he said that there were two nuns from South Africa who were socialists, and they were treated better than Larry Wimmer was because he was from Chicago. I mean, it's a very funny story. And one time, Larry Wimmer went up and drew a supply and demand curve on the board, and they went over and erased it. Said, no, we don't want, no graphs. It's all verbal. And so that was kind of the negative part. But now it's starting to come back, and in fact, I've always felt I have one foot in the Austrian school and one foot in the Chicago school. And I'm a very close friend of Milton Friedman, and I also gave the last private interview to Friedrich Hayek. Never got to meet Mises, but I've always considered both schools a really valuable contribution to this area. And so in the last issue of Ideas on Liberty, we had Milton Friedman write an article for us called My 5 Favorite Libertarian Books, so you might want to pick up that issue.
All right, our time is up, unfortunately. It's been a great session, and we're glad to have all of you here, and we're glad to have had Mark Skousen telling us about his book.
Okay, we're going to take a short break here, and then I'll introduce Dinesh D'Souza. So in 5 minutes, yeah.
Mark Skousen is the president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He's the author of several books, including The Making of Modern Economics, The Lives and Ideas of the Great Thinkers. It's published by M.E. Sharp, and you can visit them online at mesharp.com.